So I titled the slide "Good Grief," and the reason why is I it made me think of Charlie Brown, and I thought of how he would say "good grief," but really grief is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be there's some good aspects to grief too. It's a hard thing, but grief helps us shape some of our experiences, and also grief is something that showed us that we loved something or somebody, etc. So I just thought that I would share why I said good grief. But today we're going to talk a little bit about working through grief and working with it, because it's something that we just don't escape, if that makes sense. So if you are new to the mental wellness chat, I just like to share just a little bit about me, and I do it in numbers. 20 is the number of years that my husband and I have been married this year. We'll actually celebrate our anniversary this next week for 20 years. 19 of those 20 years have been with me living with MS. So I was diagnosed as a newlywed. 18 of those years, I have been a social worker that is specialized in helping people live with chronic disease, and specifically multiple sclerosis has been my specialty, and helping people find the emotional wellness component of this disease. And then 17 is the number of years that my son turns next week. So I had my son after my diagnosis. So that my story kind of just is easy to understand in that context. But if I was not diagnosed with MS myself, I don't know if I'd quite be doing this. But I definitely love what I do, and I love that I can connect with many people as well. So we'll move on to our next slide, and we're just going to take a moment and thank Beatrice for their sponsorship of this program. They have been a sponsor for quite a while now, and because of them, we are able to have our continuous monthly mental wellness chat. And also thank you to MS Views and News for working with me early on and coming up with the idea of doing this program. We've been doing it for about 4 years now, which is exciting and very cool. So we'll move on to our next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about multiple sclerosis and grief, but I also want to know that grief is kind of like an overarching theme sometimes, an experience that someone might experience related to MS or not even related to MS, and this is a good periodic topic for us to cover, because with MS there are definitely lots of ebbs and flows in the disease, and big losses sometimes and small losses. Also there could be gains, but there is a lot of grief associated with the disease. MS in itself can cause a lot of unpredictable symptoms. Natasha was sharing, that she has some burning in her right leg. I'm guessing, Natasha, that you weren't experiencing that 2 weeks ago, possibly. And so with MS, you can have a lot of ebb and flow and changes in your day to day and how you're feeling, and it's a very unpredictable disease sometimes. And that can be confusing too, because that can make it hard to know how to plan, for the future. And so when we define the grief and loss in the context of MS, there's a general sense of, with if you may have lost a loved one, or have lost someone that you care about, or experience that type of grief, it's some of those experiences can be similar in the sense that but with MS it might be that you lose some of your abilities. You might lose some of your identity. You could lose some independence, some roles, even maybe some future expectations. And the way that MS can happen, the way that we live with MS and how unpredictable sometimes that it can be, that it can actually can cause like a little bit of grief just, due to its, unpredictable progression. So for example, and I use myself in examples because it's a little bit easier to pick on myself sometimes, but but when I do work full time, but when I look at my fatigue level from when I was first diagnosed to 19 years, 19 years ago to now, much different, much different. So it was a gradual progression of fatigue, right? So that can cause a level of grief as well. And grief is a normal response to a loss, and it's not a sign of weakness. Now I'm going to read a couple more comments before we switch over, but I to a different slide. But one of the things I wanted to mention was if you share anything that you don't want me to read out loud, just I want you to say don't read it out loud at first, and then tell me what you want to tell me. Um, let's see. So we have Natasha who shares that she lost her son 3 years ago in October, and she's still grieving. Absolutely. Grieving is such a process. We don't go away from it. There's not a finish line, and it's we grow around it essentially. So thank you for sharing. I lost someone very special to me earlier in the summer, and it's hard. The grieving process can be very challenging. Krista says, I miss the before the effects of MS. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a very common thing that we can grieve. The life before we were diagnosed to and even some of the abilities that we had. Krista said, especially cognitive abilities. And yes, on the fatigue, she agreed with me. And Natasha said the burning sensation started about 2 weeks ago. So that's, kind of when you have a new symptom or you have something kind of coming up, or even if it's a pseudo relapse, a symptom that, is there that is kind of reoccurring, that can give you some feelings of anxiety and can also connect to grieving too. So we're going to move on to the next slide. And I'm going to read, Barbara said, this year's been hard for me. I'm realizing that I'm unable to do many things I was able to do before. It had me thinking, and I went down a rabbit hole and was depressed and very weepy. So, Barbara, I'm glad that you're showing up here. And I'm glad that you're saying this year is hard. And I think that connection of like realizing, that the MS has had some changes and changed what you're able to do. That is a hard awareness. Now, there are things that we can do. I'm not balancing this out because we're talking about grief and the feelings, so it's going to feel hard. As finding things that we can do and how we can adapt those things. But I'm not minimizing those feelings because we need to feel them. And if we don't allow ourselves to feel them, they will chase us, those feelings. So remembering that grieving it's healthy, it's normal, it's valuable to have those feelings. It's a natural response, and it can cause a variety of different emotions. And can look different from person to person. David says friendship relationships. I'm guessing that he maybe is grieving a friendship relationship. So we'll move on to the next slide. And physical, so some of the type of losses associated with MS is one is physical losses. So with our mobility, physical strength, sensory function, there can be emotional losses such as like self-esteem, body image, sense of control. There can be social losses, changes in relationships, loss of social connections, or career changes. And there can even be future-oriented losses, like loss of some future plans, dreams, and kind of the beginning of a predictable life path. Now we're going to talk about things that we can control here too, because I know that it's really important to me to find a mid-balance when we talk about hard things. But all of those things really are types of losses that people can experience due to their MS. Let's move on to our next slide. So I wanted to ask you in the chat box, which type of loss has been the most challenging for you or someone you know with MS? And I'll get us started. So for me, one of the probably the biggest loss for me is just kind of the I miss the being able to be very naive about health, and now that I have MS, like I just, I'm I don't get to plan some of the same things in the same way, so I miss that, and definitely miss some of the physical changes probably too, like some of the abilities that I had were different. I'm going to read on. Krista says, I'm grieving the fact that I cannot do my job safely and I have to leave my position. That is huge. Krista, one thing I will, and that's a really big loss that can be associated with MS is losing or changing a job, or having to make changes to your career. And I can tell you as a therapist, I'm currently in a role where I'm the director of patient education for the Neuroendocrine Tumor Research Foundation. So I work with oncology patients in my current role, and I do patient education. But prior to that, I was doing therapy full time, and I was working with people living with neurological disease, specifically a lot of MS patients. And one of the hardest things that was for many people was, during that transition of having to make a change for the job, because not only was it changing a job, it was changing an identity, it was changing security, it was changing. There was so many things wrapped up into changing kind of some of their social outlets. It just really a lot of losses associated with that. It's usually a very hard time for people. I recommend counseling so much during that period. Paula says, I grieve the loss of who I used to be. The progression makes it harder. Also, losing my niece in February to a tragic car accident hurt and gave me new symptoms. So, thank you for sharing, Paula. Yeah, it's a very common thing to grieve the person you were versus the person that you are now, with the abilities that you have now versus what you had before, and then of course with a tragic. Eric says, I'm new to the retirement community and have had new friends pass away. Natasha said, losing her son. Sandy said, my doctor in the rehab I just got out of want me to switch to a wheelchair. I'm sad and angry. I'm going to ask any of you, I don't know if who on this call or who on this chat is using a wheelchair, or have had to switch to using like a rollator where they haven't had to use a rollator before. Let's tell Sandy, like, were you sad or angry about it? Because I'm going to tell you, as a therapist, I've worked with people, and it's such a common feeling, and it's okay to feel sad and angry about it, and frustrated. Bruce says, my loss of cognitive along with my fatigue. Terry said, my independence was primary. Natasha says that I miss the way I used to walk. Rick says, the dexterity in my hands, it limits my woodworking. Paula said, future plans have changed dramatically for me. Krista says, cognitive loss. I was like the general public and thinking disability was just physical. Yeah, and it's not. It very much can be cognitive. Lena says, not following group conversations sometimes. So is that I'm thinking that that's a loss in general. Just if I'm making it hard to follow this conversation, let me know. But I bet, like, being in a big conversation, that sometimes it can be kind of hard and overstimulating and too many things going on. And then physical loss from Katrina. Michaela said, I was diagnosed when I was 13 and now I'm 15. Michaela, I'm glad that you're on here. Thank you for being on here. I grieve the life that I could have had and the life I planned for before myself getting MS. And Michaela, I applaud you for being on here, because you're a lot younger than most people. I know when I was first diagnosed, I was the newlywed, and I grieved for my husband. I felt really bad, and I couldn't look forward to what 20 years would look like later. And 20 years later, I had still been able to do most of the things that I wanted to do. But it's really hard because it does halt you, because you just don't know. It's unpredictable. Sherry said, the loss of my family relationships. I have a small family and they just don't get it. I don't know how to get my family back, including my 2 children. Julie says, my walking and out with my walker and moving fast. Barbara said physical, driving, and walking at a normal pace, also social and friendships. Joe says, I feel my grief is feeling MS has me disconnected me from my emotions. Anne says, loss of goals, but you always have your singing voice. After 3 times of COVID, not so much. You can always teach. I am burnout of the constant adjustments over the 20 years with MS. So it sounds like she's had to make multiple changes. Paula has had the experience where she's had to use a rollator, and Barbara as well. And Rick says, loneliness after loss of my soulmate. That's huge. Barbara says, very upset. Rick says, cane once in a while. Natasha says, I use a rolly and cane. Paula says, I used to, I had to get used to needing it, so it didn't really bother me. And Katrina says, I only a wheelchair for long distances. Actually, it made my life easier, but I can still walk, so there's a difference. Carol says, having to plan everything based on daily changes. Paula says, I miss going on for walks like I used to. David says he uses a wheelchair. Terry says she uses a wheelchair for the last 25 years. No big deal. New freedom found. So she's been able to shift. But there is a grieving process, at first. Joe says, wheels here. And this was not the plan, but had to move on, of course. So Sandy's asking a question, and I'm going to continue on with the presentation. I'm going to read the rest of the comments, I'm going to ask the question a little bit closer to the end, Sandy, and I'm just making a note so I don't miss it. Okay. Carol says, having to constantly remind my family that my health is my priority. Rick says dyslexia. And Katie said sorry for Natasha that her birth month is in October and her mom is in hospice and slowly worsening. So we'll talk a little bit about anticipatory grief too. And then David said mobility, having to wait on people. And Linda says, hi, Linda. And I think I missed you in the beginning. I grieve all over again every time a new or worsening symptom comes up. Absolutely. And then Anne says, I was in a wheelchair, but newer meds plus PT has me up for shorter distances. So thank you. Linda said she just came on, but it's good to see you. So let's move on to our next slide. So there's, you guys know, like grief is a part of this disease, and it's inevitable, and it can be, grief in real time. It can be, grief, when you're first diagnosed. It can be grief when something else happens. It can be sometimes looking back and kind of reflecting and feeling, having senses of grief. There's a lot of grief because of all the different losses. So there's different stages in grief, and I'm not going to go through all of them because I want to really talk more about the emoting and kind of get where you guys are connecting. But there's, in grief, there can be denial, there can be anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And people, it's not, if I had a whiteboard right now and I would draw a line and I would say, people think that grief is linear often, that you go through this mark, check, I did that. I was, I was in denial, but now I'm not. And I was sad, but now I was depressed and now I'm not. People think that, but no, it looks like a big scribble scrabble. And you can find yourself even going back to some of the stages, but you have to allow yourself to be where you are when you're grieving. And you may visit these stages, multiple times throughout your journey, and especially when you're living with MS, and then just living in general and life in general. And we've had people on here, that have talked about other losses, related to, losing a child or a parent being in hospice, or losing a soulmate, like losing people that are important to you at this point in our lives. we all have experienced those kind of losses and will continue to experience losses, which is really unfortunate, but a part of loving is experiencing that. Everybody's process with grief is so different and so unique. And so I want to reiterate that for you, that you may, your grief may look a little bit different than how someone else grieves. And sometimes we may try to push away our feelings that we're feeling. You know, we might be busy in the moment or there's a lot going on. But we do have to kind of cope and deal with how we're feeling too, because if we don't, that feeling will sort of just chase us. So we're going to move on to the next slide. So this was a slide that I actually used during COVID when I did a presentation on kind of like adapting to the new normal. And, you know, by golly, we have adapted. You know, it was when I did that presentation a long time ago, many years ago, we were all in a different spot, but we're in a different spot now. We have kind of came through a lot of it, but I like to talk also about the stages of change, because when something happens, and a lot of times grief, you know, being grief is a big change. And so with that, you may have shock, you know, at first, you know, you may literally just be, you know, kind of blown away that whatever you're experiencing, either related to your disease or life. Then sometimes we try to bargain with ourselves and deny, you know, and this sometimes, you know, I would say is a natural part of grieving when we have physical losses. That there's a teeter-tottering that can happen sort of when you know, durable medical equipment is needed, and I understand it because I think I'll do the same teeter-tottering if I am in that position one day. But I've helped many people while they're in that position, but I know that like it's natural probably to experience that. Then you can get frustrated, kind of recognizing that things are different. And this can make you angry. So it makes me think of, Barbara, what you were talking about. Believe, yeah, it was Barbara. And then you might feel sad about it. And then over time, so this is not like, you know, this is, and you can kind of, you know, go through, but this is more about just change. Over time, you may, you know, learn to engage in the new situation, and you start to sort of experiment a little bit. So you may see that, you know, having the relator or using you know, the wheelchair is beneficial at certain moments, and you start to adapt to some of those changes. It doesn't mean that those other things aren't there, and it doesn't mean that you're still not grieving. But and you can't, you know, get to one spot without, you know, without really kind of going through that messy, you know, time. And then you kind of, you know, think, okay, so now I know what the situation is. I know what, you know, I need going forward, and you start to, you know, to move forward. And then you integrate these changes, you know, into you know, your life, and that becomes sort of like your you know, you become renewed a little bit. So I related this to COVID back in the day, but I just wanted to also bring it up because grief and loss has a lot to do with change too. Not all the time, but very much so. So we're going to move on to our next slide. We're going to talk about common emotional reactions. And by the way, I'm sharing flowers from a trip over the summer. I decided for my PowerPoints for everyone that I would start sharing beautiful things if and I wouldn't just keep them on my phone. So that's my I love hydrangeas, and so I wanted to share them this month with you. So so some common emotional reactions for grief. One's anger, sadness, frustration, anxiety, maybe fear. And these emotions can really be intensified, you know, due to the unpredictable nature of MS. So you may, for grief, just regular grief, process feel these, but with MS, it's kind of complicated. It complicates grief a little bit, and especially the nature of the disease sometimes. And it's important for you to be able to acknowledge and validate these feelings. Like it really made me happy, to be honest. Reading all of the things we're grieving did not make me happy, of course, because that would be weird. But it actually helped me. It made me happy to see that so many people are willing to kind of just put out there the things that they're grieving, and share that with one another, because we need to be able to kind of acknowledge and really be able to validate how we feel. And even if it's different than somebody else, you might know someone in a support group, or might know someone in your community that looks like that they just transitioned very beautifully when something happened and they had a big health change. And you might not feel like you're in that situation, but that doesn't matter, because you are you, and your process is your process, and your grief is your grief. It's individual as you are as a person. So we're going to move on to our next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about strategies for working through grief and loss. So one of the main things is to really be able to acknowledge and accept your feelings. And when you're doing that, you are not judging how you feel. So I will share a small story, but I lost someone very special to me this summer, and it was a unexpected loss. It was fast, and I was not expecting it, and it made the summer actually kind of cloudy for me. And I felt really bad about it, but then I felt bad because this was just a really close friend, a family friend, a really important person in my life, but I wasn't family. And I remember showing up and feeling, just kind of uncomfortable. And I allowed myself to feel that way. And it's okay that I feel uncomfortable, but this person was like family to me, even though I'm not with the family. I'm standing on the outside with other people that she went to church with and volunteered with, etc. But acknowledging how you're feeling. Also seeking professional support. There's, counseling, there's therapy, there's support groups. There are a lot of different resources. For MS related grief, that was a big part of therapy work that I did with people, is to help them kind of move through some of the stages of the disease, and through some of the grief of it. Did it still mean that some of the losses were still there? Absolutely, but it gave them good coping mechanisms and place to talk about it. And also being able to practice mindfulness and radical self-compassion. Being able to journal, maybe get some of your feelings out, being able to connect with someone. I know anytime I've made actually a treatment change, if a treatment was failing or not working, I felt, again, that was another grief, it was another loss, another change. So I might call some of my friends for that mess. Maintaining social connections. It's very natural that when you're going through grief and loss, that you feel different and sad sometimes, and we kind of sometimes want to back away and pull back, and that's okay for some things, but still maintaining a sense of some of your connections, and some of your routine and such as you can, because that can help you as you're dealing with that. Setting realistic goals, focusing on what can be done today, recognizing limits, and celebrating small victories. I know, emotional energy is something too. And when you're grieving a loss, either because of disease or because you're grieving a person, sometimes we have to step back and say, I need to show myself radical compassion today, and love myself and take care of myself, and know I can't show up for the world in every way that they want me to, and how they expect I need to take care of me. Create new routines and new roles. The routines and structure can be helpful, especially if you're feeling kind of lost. Sometimes in grief, we can feel lost. And especially if we are adapting to physical changes, we may need to have, a new routine, new roles, reevaluate kind of what we were doing before and how can we change that to help us now. And when you reevaluate, and adapt to roles, it can really help you. It can be very meaningful for you. So I've got some people here that said some things. So Natasha said I was diagnosed in 2007 and I haven't worked since 2008. And so that is a very common experience for people that they have had an MS diagnosis and haven't been able to work. Um, and that's it's a big loss because it's a lot of different losses in different ways. It could be financial, a financial loss. It could be a social loss. It could be a purpose loss, and so it is very important to to depending. It's been some time for you, but if you're someone who is if your disease is causing changes in your employment or changes in your life that are big lifestyle changes, then working with a counselor can be very helpful because sometimes we have to redefine what we think purpose is. We have to make some adjustments, and we also have to go through the grieving process. Paula said, I did an emotional journal class and learned how to replace a negative feeling to a positive one, and it helps me. There is one of the slides on here. I have to be really careful when I build these PowerPoints for you because I can either put a bazillion slides. But there was one on reframing, and the reframing can be very helpful. It does not take away the negative, but it helps to kind of reformat what we're saying. And thank you, Rick. Rick just said sorry for my loss. And then Paula says, I take days off from social media and it helps me. How many of you do that? I do that too, and that does help me sometimes as well. I like feeling connected, and I like a little bit of disconnection sometimes too. Let's move on to our next slide. So what strategies do you find most helpful for coping with grief and loss related to MS? I know, I'll get us started. So for me, as a person, one of the things that when I'm going through grief and loss related to my disease, I find a lot of power in connecting with people that, like some of my friends that have MS, that would understand, because then I feel less alone. And that is very helpful for me as a strategy. I also, in the early on in my diagnosis, went to see a therapist, and that was helpful for me too, to help me adjust. So when you're dealing with, and I think actually the journaling can be a great thing too. Krista says, I have a therapist that I asked to challenge me to see the loss in a different light, so from a different perspective. And I think that is that probably is a very helpful thing too, because sometimes these losses are gains too. I talked about my fatigue level and my energy, and while it's a loss, it also is a win, because it's I know my body better than people with MS generally know their bodies really well, but we know our bodies better than most people know theirs. My self-care game is pretty good, and then also I've learned to slow down and to really enjoy what I have, and that is a big part of having something that's unpredictable, is that it's allowed me, and also working with patients with cancer, that type of work, it has allowed me to really help and kind of hone in on focus, on what the things that I have in front of me and the abilities. So I'm going to let you keep on connecting, but you might see that you may have found new meaning. You may have worked on self-care practices. You may have learned to set realistic goals. You may also have used social networks, like I've said. So we're going to move on to the next slide. So there's opportunity to build resilience through grief. And this is just a silver lining here. We do get some levels of resilience through the process, and I wish that we didn't have to do hard things that created losses. There will never be a justification that I will be able to offer you, give you, or want to offer you or give you for anyone that you've lost in your life, or anything that you've had to deal with and cope with, because I just don't think that I don't believe that everything happens for a reason all the time. I don't think that's a fair thing to say. But I do think that we do get some resilient strategies through these challenges, and definitely through MS and some of the physical changes and those changes that people have with their disease. I definitely can see that people have found some ability to adapt and to learn from the adversity that they've experienced and the losses that they experience. And so that makes them a little bit more resilient. And so even we've heard like some of the resilient strategies, in here as well. But encouraging, to build resilient skills, and so you focus on strengths, you focus on your new meaning, and maintaining hope. Finding that balance, but you have to let yourself grieve the things that you've lost. If you're frustrated and you're angry and you're sad right now, it is okay. Be those things. Don't always stay there. And when it's time to move through them, you will. But you've got to feel the feelings that you're feeling. But allow yourself to also find the strengths, find that new meaning. What does this new part of my life mean? And then finding the things that give you a sense of hope. And furthermore, finding or maintaining a sense of purpose and an identity outside of your MS diagnosis, as well as outside of your job if you're working. Finding things that give you a sense of purpose, that are not directly connected to your MS all the time, and that's not actually directly connected to your job either. I think those are both important things. And it can be kind of hard things to explore. And definitely I recommend, with a counselor, that's something that you can do. I think one of my things for purpose is making art and finding joy in things outside. And so, it's a little bit different. So I help people with my job, and I have MS, and that's a big part of my life, but I don't want those two things to define me in total. We have Barbara that says, I do work full time and try not to think about my situation, but it comes to mind easily when I feel challenged in my movement. I just try to think positive thoughts or try to cheer someone else who may be having a difficult time or day. One of the things that a long time ago that I came across, there was a person who wrote herself a letter. And I believe she is either a physician or a physician assistant or nurse practitioner. She has MS, but she's in the medical field. And she wrote herself a letter for on the days that are bad days. And she did it on a good day. She wrote this letter, and it was actually I thought a really good exercise to do, because we have ups and downs and ebbs and flows often, and she was able to give herself the encouragement she needed to hear on a bad day, and have that for the future. Terry said, there's people worse off than we are. All we need to do is find ways and like-minded people to help them. It helps me in the end. Helping other people can help you, definitely. And there is always somebody in a worse situation, a different situation. But I can tell you that everybody's situation is so individual, and it's tough, but being able to help people, being able to maybe lift someone else up sometimes can help. You just finding the things that can help you to feel more resilient and feel like you have an identity outside of living with just MS, or not just MS, living with MS. So we're going to move on to the next slide. It's getting progressively darker here. You tell fall is on its way soon. So we're going to talk a little about the role of healthcare providers and caregivers. I'm just going to go through this. I'm going to try to put my light on and see if it makes it too. That's better. Okay, easier for my eyes. So it is important to tap into, if you are dealing with a extended grief reaction, if you are experiencing quality of life changes with depression or anxiety, definitely let your healthcare provider know. It's, healthcare providers are pretty in tune to the amount of losses that people might experience with MS, especially your MS specialist or your neurologist should. But if you're struggling with it, if you need to be connected to a therapist or need to be able to process or talk to someone, they will not be able to do it with you, but maybe they can help find someone for you. The next slide we're going to talk about is the practicing radical self-compassion. And with this, we're going to move on to the next slide. And we're going to talk about having a kind of like just a very fair attitude to yourself and not be critical or judgmental about how you feel. Practicing how you feel and how you talk about yourself or how you acknowledge your feelings in a warm, gently, fair way, in a non-judgmental way. And taking care of yourself, rather than denying yourself of your needs, kind of thinking about what your needs are and looking out for your own health and your own happiness. And so this means like eating regular meals. It might be moving a little bit, getting enough sleep, which we won't go there today because we don't have enough time to talk about sleep. But just taking care of you, especially when you're in a moment of grief, like it is important to make sure you are tuning into you and taking care of yourself. And then also acknowledging and accepting that the struggle is normal. And when you're going through a process of grief, the feelings that you have are pretty normal. And so giving yourself space to just allow yourself to be. Katrina says, I like the letter strategy. I've had a couple people do that over the years, and it was a very effective thing. And Natasha says, I find my faith in God has brought me a long way. And a lot of times people can find hope through their religion, their connections, etc. So we're going to move on to our next slide. And before I talk about this, I just wanted to mention that we can practice mindful awareness, and that is just sort of being just very aware of the feelings that we're having and the response that we have, and just kind of accepting it in the moment, and not judging how we feel or allowing yourself to own. And I'm so glad that we've had people, be able to say today, it made me sad, it made me frustrated, it made me angry, that kind of thing, because we need to be able to do that. And not using words like I shouldn't be mad. It's okay to say I feel mad. I feel upset. So not shouldn't, it's just how you feel. That's okay. So there's an acronym for managing grief and loss, and so this is the HEAL model. I shared this actually during that COVID episode or COVID session that we did a while back, because there was a lot of grief and loss during that period of time. Just even loss of change in our schedule, what life looked like. I mean, there's just a variation, loss in how people felt sometimes, emotionally and physically with the disease, and with COVID, if they got sick. And so H, it means honor the loss. It is acknowledging and honor your loss. It's important. Part of healing is honoring. The other day, or a couple weeks ago, I had to travel for work, and I wore the same dress that I wore to that special person in my life, their funeral. I wore a blue flowered dress because that person inspired me to like floral stuff. And I wore the dress again, and I wore it to a work event, and someone said, I love that dress. And I said, thank you. I wore it a couple weeks ago in honor of the big loss that I have. And wearing this dress makes me think of her right now. And so finding ways to honor, writing in a journal, sharing your stories, looking at pictures, memories and stuff. And that can be hard too when we're thinking about physical losses that happen because of the disease. Allowing yourself, the E is expressing emotion, allowing yourself to express how you feel. The A is acknowledging obstacles. So acknowledge the things that are kind of making it difficult for you to take care of yourself and to work through the loss. And then the L stands for love yourself in the process. And to show yourself love. So heal is a model for managing grief. We're going to go through the next slide because I know we're almost out of time. This is going too fast, and I wanted to ask a question. So when do we know that we've reached a new normal? Here's the deal. There's no finish line. When we go through, and with MS, sometimes there's not there's a new period of time, a new adjustment, but there's in life there's going to be some ebbs and flows with MS usually, and life is a continuous, has continuous movement and change. And so there's not a finish line. You will get to the place when you've been able to kind of incorporate the loss into your life and be able to have honored your emotions and your feelings and work through them. But it doesn't mean that you're over it. I don't think we get over it, if that makes sense. Linda said, when I made the shift to give myself grace, it helped me so much when I no longer was hard on myself. That's really good advice. And then Julie, and thank you for what you said. Linda said, we just become more resilient. And that is absolutely the truth. And so I usually, for when I talk about grief, I would think of, I usually will talk about if I had a pickle jar. If you can imagine like a pickle jar where there's a tennis ball. And when I was doing therapy, I would drop the tennis ball in the pickle jar, and it was small. And it seemed like, and I said, the tennis ball is grief. And as you can see, it's like touching almost everything in this jar. It's the empty jar, by the way. And that's how grief feels. It feels consuming. It feels like it takes everything over. And then what happens over time is that the tennis ball doesn't get smaller. We can't throw it out because it'll come right back into that jar. What happens is that we grow around our grief. And so I said, you can imagine like one of those big size pickle jars from like Sam's or Costco, and the tennis ball in there, and you can see that the grief is still the same size, but you've grown around it, and life has kind of continued on, and there's been other, experiences, other things, and so with grief that does often happen if you can do it in a healthy way. Paula said, just got to get rid of the waves of MS, or I got to ride the waves of MS. Yeah, learning how to, I think about that with anxiety and depression, or anxiety especially, sometimes learning how to kind of deal with the wave because it kind of comes and it goes sometimes. And then Rick says, normal is a moving target. Absolutely. So let's move on to our next slide. So I don't want to do this. Instead, I want so if anyone has any quick inspirations for Barbara on how you dealt with changes in your body, like for the people that have had to transition to like a wheelchair, or have had to stop working, like, or how do you cope with a change? And I think it takes time, and it's all these things that we talked about, but I just wanted to make sure we asked that question. So if you've had deterioration because of your disease, what have you done to cope? So I want to offer that up as a topic. We're going to move, or as a question. We're going to move slides so that way the slide won't be confusing. So you are not alone. These are just some pressed hydrangeas I did. I can't grow a hydrangea to save my life. So if you thought those pictures were in my garden, they were not. These are all my friends' gardens, or from my friends' gardens, and I just pressed the hydrangeas, but in sharing with you. But you are not alone. And I think often the biggest challenge that we have is the feeling that we're by ourselves, and we're walking by ourselves, and we are alone in this process, and we are not. And I want you to know that. And I think that that's an important thing to acknowledge and to recognize, because grief is a process that we often walk through because of this disease, and then just because of life too. So it's like extra grief. And so for people like Barbara that's asking about, from other people, like, how do you handle it? There's a lot of other people that have been here, and definitely I was able to read through a lot of other experiences where people are using durable medical equipment like canes, walkers, rollators, and all of those have their emotional toll, as they learn to have to use those things. And then eventually some people come to the other side where they realize it's powerful to use them. It makes them more independent, it makes things easier. But that is hard. Um, Thank you, Rick. So we have Linda here says, I process my emotions in therapy. I adapt, adjust, and move on. But we have to process them. We have to talk about them. We have to name them. We have to feel them. We've got to give place. David says, faith, medication, and it's okay. So it can be, connecting with other people. Meditation might be medication if you need that for any mental health symptoms as well. But knowing that you're not alone. Katrina says, time, being realistic about the situation from help, which allows me to get out of my house more and get to the point A to B. Then it's worth it if others think, even if others still look at you differently. Hold your own and know your truth. We all get you. So that was for you, Barbara. I feel it's a helping device for us, and that's how I've changed my thinking using a rollator. Thank you for sharing that. And Linda says patience. So we're going to move on to the next slide. We're going to thank Beatrice again for their support, and we'll move on to the next slide. But I'm going to leave you with this. To do activities you love. So as children, most of us spend hours, we spent hours playing, but as adults, we forget how to play sometimes. And the things that we like to do as children, there might be a variation of something that you like to do as an adult. So I want you to think about what are 5 things that you like to do when you were growing up. And then I want you to list 5 ways that you can do something similar again. Just a little bit of inspiration, but playing is important, and it actually can allow us to be more creative. It can help us to feel a little bit more joyful, and it can also help us with feelings of anxiety, depression, and feeling connected with who we are. So I'm going to channel you to find something that you like to do. So we'll move on to the next slide. So if you know me, if you're new here, know this. I don't say goodbye. I say I'll see you later. And that is just very much what I'm going to do. So I am going to look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you for being on. Stay on, please, to complete the survey. I always pay attention to it. You guys mean a lot to me, and I think to each other too. We're quite the community. I'll see you next month. Bye.